The science of economics is rational. Our reasons for supporting a particular economic theory are wildly irrational, personal, emotional, idiosyncratic, to a greater extent than anyone wants to admit. Political science is a science that in the same sense is rational, but we all push and pull at the political system for totally irrational, totally emotional reasons. Racism is a real factor in this public policy debate. But what is the correct thing to do, economically and politically, has nothing to do with racism. The facts of the case remain true whether you personally are racist or not, and there is racism on all sides of this issue. There is left-wing racism, and believe it or not, there's even anti-white racism. It's a significant factor in understanding mass immigration and the impact it has in our society. When I go to a grocery store and all of the staff are Chinese except for one white guy in a jean jacket, what are my assumptions about that white guy? I will perceive the new immigrants from China who can barely speak English, who are working in this grocery store, as noble, honest people, pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, working their way up from poverty. And I will presume this one white guy in a jean jacket, working the same minimum wage job in the same grocery store, I'll assume he's an ex-convict. I'll assume he has a history as a drug addict. I'll assume there's something wrong with him. He may be an honest man doing an honest job, but my perception of him is prejudicial. It's racist. In this way, multiculturalism and mass immigration conditions us all to be racist. Now, tell me, Japan. Is it in Japan's best interest to import 100% of their medical doctors from Pakistan? To go to the universities and close down the Department of Medical Science, cease to train and educate people to become surgeons and so on, say, hey, look, guys, economically, it just makes more sense. It's just more efficient for us to employ doctors educated in Pakistan. We can't compete with the Pakistani education system in producing thousands of medical doctors willing to work at low wages and who are trained at very low rates of tuition. Should the government of Japan shut down a whole bunch of university campuses and say, look, guys, there is no point in training and educating Japanese citizens to become nurses. We can simply import all of the nurses we need from the Philippines. They'll work for lower salaries. They're educated at a lower rate of tuition. If you think the only thing that matters is money, if you think that political science is about making short-term, self-indulgent decisions about what is going to cost less money today, this month, or this year, then it is inevitable and inexorable that you will agree this is the rational thing to do for Japan, this is the rational thing to do for Canada, for Great Britain, and then, of course, any view to the contrary must be motivated by racism and xenophobia. But I think there's part of you, whoever you are in the audience, whether you are left, right, or center, there's part of you that just instinctually thinks there's something wrong with this picture. There's something wrong with a society like Japan, like England, so on, making the decision to become reliant on foreign temporary workers, new immigrants, and refugees to be their doctors and nurses. And yet it seems to be more difficult to get people to recognize that there's something even more profoundly wrong with relying on foreign labor in this sense, whether we're talking about new immigrants, refugees, temporary work permits, with relying on foreign labor to perform minimum wage jobs. And the problem here is not about protecting opportunities for Canadian citizens born in Canada, all right? It's about what is best for society as a whole in the long term. In Japan, minimum wage is about $6.50 an hour. Many of the surrounding countries in Asia, you will find minimum wage $6.50 per day or less. What is the real minimum wage in the Philippines, especially once you get outside the capital city, once you get outside of Manila? What is the real minimum wage in Cambodia? Is it in the best interests of Japan, the people of Japan, Japan as a society as a whole, is it in their best interest to become internally divided between Japanese citizens who work for Japanese wages and temporary foreign workers, new immigrants, refugees, who work for less? Now, if you own a factory in Japan, you may feel it is in your best interest in the short term to import labor from Cambodia, to import labor from the Philippines, and to pay them as little as possible. That's short-term, self-interested thinking for one factory, one industry. But you will concede the point that what is best for our society as a whole is to have one minimum wage, one set of standards that apply to everyone, and that challenge every industry to make the best possible use of labor. In economic parlance, this is called moving up the value chain. And there has been some shockingly naive mainstream news reporting on the social effects of the state of California raising the minimum wage to $20 an hour for employees at McDonald's, employees at fast food restaurants of various kinds. What happens? All of a sudden, technologies that have been around for 20 years and 30 years start being deployed in fast food restaurants, forms of automation and streamlining that they did not use before. One of the most dramatic examples of this is shoe factories. Shoe factories, to some extent, clothing. There are technologies that can automate, mechanize, streamline the production of shoes, a lot of which is stitching, by the way, stitching the sole. So stitching together the different bits of fabric, but also stitching the rubber sole onto the rest of the shoe, stitching together clothing. You can have a high-tech factory with highly paid workers. Workers, a large part of their job is maintaining and cleaning and disassembling and reassembling these complex machines, right? You can have a factory making clothes or making shoes that's just as high-tech as an automotive plant, as a high-tech, factory producing cars in the United States of America, right? But you can also have a factory that is low-tech, that relies on minimum wage labor, where the profitability relies on paying people as little as possible and exploiting them as much as possible. Which one is in the best interest of Japan as a society as a whole over the long term? It is in Japan's best interest to exclude these foreign laborers working at a lower rate, both through minimum wage and through more informal ones, to push the whole society to move up the value chain, to not try to compete for what we could call the lowest common denominator, to not try to compete with Cambodia and the Philippines for who can do labor cheapest, but instead who can produce the product at the highest level of sophistication. Sophistication, that's why I'm using this term. There are implications for the product itself, whether it is a handmade product or a high-tech project, and there are implications for the process, right? For the type of production, the type of machinery, how high-tech everything involved is. Okay? The most basic concept of politics, not just in a democratic society, even in a dictatorship. The most basic concept of politics is that we collectively make decisions that are in everyone's best interest over the long term. Instead of one man making decisions in his own self-interest in the short term, or one company or one factory making decisions in the short term. Now, you may think, hey, these are extreme examples that I've used so far. Medical doctors and nurses on the one hand, minimum wage labor in a factory on the other. I'm actually going to give you a more extreme example. This is the most extreme example. China needs 1 million English teachers. Okay? Canada needs 10,000 Chinese teachers. Short term, you can make the argument the government of China should just import 1 million Americans, Canadians, British people. They should just import 1 million foreigners who speak English as their first language. They'll come into China. They'll do this job, teaching English to Chinese children, Chinese adults, to all the Chinese people who need to learn English. The same problem is there with Japan becoming dependent upon Pakistan and the Philippines to provide them with doctors and nurses. It's the same problem. This is the most extreme example because there is a sense in which someone who's born and raised in Canada speaking English as their first language will always have an advantage over someone born and raised in China. Whereas someone born and raised in Pakistan has no advantage that makes them better at medical science than someone born and raised anywhere else in the world, speaking any other language anywhere in the world. What is actually in China's best interest is to develop universities, develop an educational system from cradle to the grave that will allow China to produce its own English teachers, that will allow them to train Chinese citizens to teach English at the highest level of excellence to other Chinese citizens. What is in Canada's best interest is to educate Canadians who are born and raised speaking English as their first language, to teach Chinese at the highest level and not to be dependent upon China. I have had conversations with several university professors who admit, running their fingers through the they admit and they lament that bringing in these Chinese nationals, people born and raised in China, people who are members of the Chinese Communist Party, bringing in people from China to teach Chinese to white, black, and Hispanic Canadians. My point is here, Canadians who were not themselves born and raised in a family where Chinese is spoken, that it is a disaster. They can never really understand how to teach the language to someone who is, fundamentally estranged from the linguistic concepts involved. And they can never deal with the political gap between these societies. There are political gaps, there are religious gaps, there are really insuperable divisions between these societies. I have been in the room with a Pakistani medical doctor, male, who could not say the word vagina. He could not deal with the sexuality built into being a medical doctor. He was so messed up by Islamic indoctrination. There it is. I met his wife. His wife was also a medical doctor who I also had an appointment with. There was a couple running this clinic in Canada. His wife was even more messed up. I mean, in case you think his wife was cool dealing with female reproductive health or anything else, okay? Guess what? Members of the Chinese Communist Party cannot come into a Canadian university and play the role we need them to play, not linguistically, not politically. We could even go as far as to say not religiously. All right? Political parties support mass immigration because it seems like a short-term solution to a long-term problem. The result instead is a society divided against itself. It includes and entails a very corrosive kind of racism. It creates a society in which people perceive honest work, honest labor at a minimum wage as a job for immigrants. Oh, driving a taxi, oh, that's a job for a Pakistani. Oh, if you're a white man who drives a taxi, there must be something wrong with you. You must be an ex-convict. It results in a society divided against itself at the highest levels: medical doctors, engineers, architects, language professors in universities, political science professors in universities, divided against itself at the highest levels as well as the lowest at minimum wage. It creates a kind of exploitative dependency of wealthy countries upon the poor, and it hobbles the development of the most crucial requirement of the 21st century of all, that we really have a self-reliant education system. An education system where we are producing enough medical doctors and nurses for ourselves at a standard of excellence, at the highest standard of excellence possible, where we are even producing enough experts in the politics of China and the Chinese language at the highest standard of excellence. And together, collectively, through mechanisms much more subtle and nuanced than just the minimum wage, but including the enforcement of the minimum wage, collectively, we move up the value chain. We don't compete with third world countries to produce t-shirts in a third world way, to produce sneakers like shoes in a third world way. We don't compete with third world countries to pay the lowest wages possible, employing large numbers of people. We don't even organize fast food restaurants in a third world way. A large number of people making hamburgers at McDonald's. We pay everyone at the McDonald's $20 an hour. And together, as a society, we move up the value chain.